Millionaire disinherits family because of a hamster. The truth about the pet in the will shocks everyone. Hello, welcome. Leave a like, subscribe, activate notifications, and enjoy this story. In a quiet New England town, eccentric millionaire Edward Holloway's decision to leave his entire fortune to a hamster sets off a chain of events that will unravel decades of family secrets and challenge everything the townsfolk thought they knew about love, loyalty, and the true meaning of family. The small town of Millbrook, Massachusetts, woke to an unusually warm autumn morning. Golden leaves drifted lazily from the trees lining Main Street, coating the sidewalks in a crisp, colorful carpet. At the far end of the street, atop a gentle hill overlooking the town, stood Holloway Manor, a sprawling Victorian mansion that had been the subject of local gossip and speculation for decades. Inside the manor's study, 78-year-old Edward Holloway sat in his favorite leather armchair, absently stroking the soft fur of the small creature nestled in his lap. Mr. Whiskers, a plump golden hamster with bright, inquisitive eyes, nibbled contentedly on a sunflower seed as Edward gazed out the window at the town below. "Well, old friend," Edward murmured, his voice gravelly with age, "I suppose today's the day we shake things up a bit." He chuckled softly, but there was a hint of sadness in his pale blue eyes. A gentle knock at the door interrupted his reverie. "Come in," Edward called, straightening in his chair. Margaret, Edward's housekeeper of 30 years, entered the room. Her salt and pepper hair was pulled back in its usual neat bun, and concern creased her kind face. "Mr. Holloway, the lawyer, is here, and your family has arrived as well." Edward nodded, a wry smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "I suppose they couldn't wait to hear the reading of the will, could they?" He sighed, gently placing Mr. Whiskers in the elaborate cage on his desk. "Very well, Margaret. Show them in." As Margaret left to fetch the guests, Edward stood and walked to the window. He could see several expensive cars parked in the circular driveway below, a stark contrast to the modest vehicles of Millbrook's residence. The door opened again, and a stream of people entered the study. First came Charles Holloway, Edward's eldest son, his designer suit as impeccable as ever. Behind him trailed his wife, Victoria, her face set in a mask of barely concealed anticipation. Edward's daughter, Elizabeth, followed, her eyes red-rimmed as if she'd been crying. Last came Edward's youngest, Timothy, looking uncomfortable in a suit that seemed a size too small. Bringing up the rear was Mr. Fleming, Edward's longtime lawyer and friend. The portly man nodded respectfully to Edward as he closed the door behind him. "Father," Charles began, his voice smooth and controlled, "we came as soon as we heard. How are you feeling?" Edward turned from the window, regarding his family with a mixture of affection and disappointment. "I'm quite well, Charles. Thank you for asking." His gaze swept over the group. "I suppose you're all wondering why I've called you here today." Elizabeth stepped forward, her voice quavering. "Dad, please, whatever this is about, can't we just talk it through as a family?" Edward's expression softened slightly. "I'm afraid it's a bit late for that, my dear. But don't worry. All will become clear soon enough." He nodded to Mr. Fleming. "Shall we begin?" The lawyer cleared his throat and pulled a thick envelope from his briefcase. "Very well, Mr. Holloway. Ladies and gentlemen, we are here for the reading of Edward Holloway's last will and testament." A collective gasp filled the room. Victoria's perfectly manicured hand flew to her mouth. "But you're not dead," she blurted out, her eyes wide with shock. Edward chuckled, the sound devoid of humor. "No, my dear daughter-in-law, I'm not. But I am old, and I've decided it's time to put my affairs in order." He gestured to Mr. Fleming. "Please, continue." The lawyer adjusted his glasses and began to read. "I, Edward James Holloway, being of sound mind and body, do hereby bequeath all of my worldly possessions, including but not limited to my estate, businesses, and financial assets to—" The room held its breath. Charles leaned forward eagerly, while Elizabeth clutched Timothy's arm. "Mr. Whiskers, my beloved hamster." For a moment silence reigned. Then chaos erupted. "This is preposterous. Charles roared, his face turning an alarming shade of red. "Father, you can't be serious." Elizabeth burst into tears, while Timothy stood slack-jawed, staring at the cage on Edward's desk. Victoria's eyes narrowed dangerously. "Edward, if this is some kind of joke, I assure you it's not," Edward interrupted, his voice firm. "Mr. Whiskers is my sole heir. The decision is final." As his family's protests grew louder, Edward turned back to the window, a single tear sliding down his weathered cheek. The truth behind this decision weighed heavily on his heart, a truth that would soon unravel everything his family thought they knew about him, about themselves, and about the true meaning of love and loyalty. The news of Edward Holloway's unusual will spread through Millbrook like wildfire. By nightfall, the entire town was abuzz with speculation and gossip. The local diner, Mabel's Place, was packed with curious residents eager to discuss the latest development in the Holloway saga. Mabel herself, a stout woman in her 60s with a no-nonsense attitude and the best apple pie in 3 counties, was holding court behind the counter. "I always knew old Ed Holloway was an odd duck," she declared, refilling a customer's coffee cup. "But leaving everything to a hamster? That's a new level of crazy, even for him." At a corner booth, Sarah Thompson, the town's high school English teacher, sat with her longtime friend, Dr. James Carter. Sarah stirred her tea thoughtfully. "There's got to be more to this story, James. Edward Holloway might be eccentric, but he's not stupid. Why would he do something like this?" Dr. Carter, the town's only veterinarian, shrugged. "Maybe he's finally lost it. Dementia can do strange things to a person's mind." Sarah shook her head. "No, I don't think that's it. I ran into Margaret at the grocery store last week. She said Mr. Holloway was as sharp as ever." As they pondered the mystery, the bell above the diner's door jingled. Elizabeth Holloway walked in, her eyes red and puffy. The diner fell silent as she made her way to the counter. "Evening, Lizzie," Mabel said softly, her usual brusque manner softening at the sight of Edward's distraught daughter. "What can I get you, honey?" Elizabeth managed a weak smile. "Just a coffee, please, Mabel. To go." As Mabel busied herself with the order, Sarah approached Elizabeth cautiously. "Liz, are you okay?" Elizabeth turned, recognizing her former teacher. "Oh, Sarah, I don't know. This whole thing is just so bizarre." She accepted the coffee from Mabel with a murmured thanks. "I keep thinking I'll wake up and it'll all be a bad dream." Sarah placed a comforting hand on Elizabeth's arm. "I can't imagine what you're going through, but if you need someone to talk to." Elizabeth nodded gratefully. "Thanks, Sarah. I might take you up on that." She glanced around the diner, noticing the curious stares. "I should go. Good night, everyone." As Elizabeth left, the diner erupted into hushed conversations once more. Sarah returned to her booth, her brow furrowed in concern. "Poor girl," Dr. Carter murmured. "I remember when she used to come to the clinic with her cat. She always seemed so happy." Sarah nodded absently, her mind racing. There was something in Elizabeth's eyes, something beyond the shock and hurt. It looked almost like guilt. Meanwhile, back at Holloway Manor, Edward sat alone in his study, Mr. Whiskers perched on his shoulder. The old man gazed at a faded photograph on his desk, a picture of a much younger version of himself, standing next to a beautiful woman with kind eyes and a bright smile. "Oh, Amelia," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "I wish you were here. You'd know how to make them understand." Mr. Whiskers squeaked softly, as if in response. Edward chuckled, gently stroking the hamster's fur. "I know, old friend. It's just you and me now. But soon they'll all know the truth." A soft knock interrupted his musings. "Come in," Edward called, quickly wiping his eyes. Margaret entered, carrying a tray with a steaming cup of tea. "I thought you might need this, sir," she said, setting the tray on his desk. Her eyes fell on the photograph, and her expression softened. "You miss her terribly, don't you?" Edward nodded, his gaze still fixed on the picture. "Every day, Margaret. Every single day. Margaret hesitated, then spoke softly. Sir, are you sure about this? The will, it's causing quite a stir in town. Edward looked up at his faithful housekeeper, a spark of determination in his eyes. I've never been more certain of anything in my life, Margaret. It's time for the truth to come out. All of it. As Margaret left the room, Edward turned back to the window. In the distance, he could see the lights of Millbrook twinkling in the darkness. He knew that in homes and businesses across town, people were talking about him, wondering what could have possessed him to make such an outrageous decision. Little did they know the hamster was just the beginning. The real shock was yet to come. A truth that would shake the very foundations of Millbrook and force everyone, from his family to the townspeople, to reevaluate everything they thought they knew about love, loyalty, and the power of unconditional kindness. Edward Holloway smiled to himself, a mix of sadness and anticipation in his aged eyes. The stage was set, the players were in place, and soon, very soon, the final act would begin. The following morning dawned gray and drizzly, mirroring the mood that had settled over Millbrook. At the local law office of Fleming and Associates, Charles Holloway paced the worn carpet, his expensive shoes leaving imprints in the pile. There has to be a way to contest this, Fleming, Charles growled, running a hand through his salt and pepper hair. It's absurd. A hamster can't inherit an estate. Mr. Fleming, seated behind his cluttered desk, sighed heavily. I understand your frustration, Charles, but your father was of sound mind when he made this decision. Legally speaking, there's very little we can do. Charles slammed his fist on the desk, causing a stack of papers to topple. This is my birthright we're talking about. I've spent my entire life preparing to take over the family business, and now it's all going to a rodent. The lawyer leaned back in his chair, studying Charles with a mixture of sympathy and wariness. Your father was very clear about his wishes. However, he paused, choosing his words carefully. There is a clause in the will that might interest you. Charles's eyes narrowed. What kind of clause? Mr. Fleming pulled out a document from a drawer. It states that if Mr. Whiskers, passes away within 6 months of your father, the estate will be divided equally among you and your siblings. A slow, calculating smile spread across Charles's face. Is that so? Well, accidents do happen, don't they? The lawyer's expression turned stern. Charles, I hope you're not implying what I think you're implying. That would be highly illegal and… Oh, relax, Fleming, Charles interrupted, waving a dismissive hand. I'm just thinking out loud. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have some family matters to attend to. As Charles left the office, Mr. Fleming slumped in his chair, a sense of foreboding settling over him. He reached for the phone, his fingers hovering over the numbers. After a moment's hesitation, he dialed. Edward, it's Fleming. We need to talk. Across town, at the Millbrook Veterinary Clinic, Dr. James Carter was just finishing up with a routine checkup when his receptionist poked her head in. Dr. Carter? There's an Elizabeth Holloway here to see you. Says it's urgent. James frowned, puzzled. Elizabeth Holloway? Show her in, please. A moment later, Elizabeth entered, cradling a familiar golden hamster in her hands. Her eyes were red-rimmed, and she looked as if she hadn't slept. Lizzie, what's wrong? James asked, concerned. Elizabeth held out Mr. Whiskers, her hands trembling. It's Dad's hamster. He's not eating and he seems lethargic. I think someone might have tried to hurt him. James gently took the hamster, his veterinary instincts kicking in. As he examined Mr. Whiskers, he couldn't help but notice Elizabeth's nervous demeanor. Lizzie, he said softly, why do you think someone tried to hurt him? Elizabeth bit her lip, tears welling in her eyes. Because I stopped them from doing worse. James's eyes widened in shock. What are you talking about? Elizabeth collapsed into a nearby chair, her shoulders shaking with sobs. It's Charles. He wanted to get rid of Mr. Whiskers, said it was for the good of the family. I caught him trying to put something in the hamster's water bottle. We argued, and… Oh, James, what am I going to do? As James listened to Elizabeth's story, his mind raced. The situation was quickly spiraling out of control, and he had a feeling that Mr. Whiskers was just the tip of the iceberg. "Lizzie," he said gently, "I think it's time you told me everything, starting from the beginning." Back at Holloway Manor, Edward sat in his study, the phone receiver clutched tightly in his hand. Mr. Fleming's warning echoed in his mind, mixing with a lifetime of regrets and secrets. A soft knock at the door jolted him from his thoughts. "Come in," he called, his voice weary. Margaret entered, her face etched with concern. "Mr. Holloway, there's someone here to see you. Says it's important." Edward sighed, rubbing his temples. "Who is it, Margaret?" "It's Sarah Thompson, sir, the high school teacher." Edward's eyebrows rose in surprise. "Sarah? Well, that's unexpected. Show her in, please." A moment later, Sarah entered the study, looking slightly out of place among the antique furniture and leather-bound books. Her eyes widened as she took in the opulent surroundings. "Ms. Thompson," Edward greeted her, gesturing to a chair. "Please have a seat. What brings you to my humble abode?" Sarah sat, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "Mr. Holloway, I hope you'll forgive my intrusion. I'm here because I'm worried about Elizabeth." Edward leaned forward, his interest piqued. "Elizabeth? What about her?" Sarah took a deep breath, choosing her words carefully. "Last night at the diner, she seemed distraught, more than one would expect, even given the circumstances. And there was something in her eyes." She trailed off, unsure how to continue. Edward studied Sarah for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then, to Sarah's surprise, he chuckled softly. "You always were an observant one, Sarah. It's one of the reasons you're such an excellent teacher." He stood, walking to the window. "Tell me, what do you see when you look out at Millbrook?" Confused by the change in subject, Sarah joined him at the window. "I see home, community, people who care about each other." Edward nodded, a sad smile on his face. "That's what I used to see. But now I see a town built on secrets and half-truths. A place where appearances matter more than reality." He turned to Sarah, his eyes filled with a mixture of determination and sorrow. "Ms. Thompson, what I'm about to tell you must remain between us, at least for now. Can I trust you with that?" Sarah nodded, her curiosity piqued. "Of course, Mr. Holloway." Edward took a deep breath, steeling himself. "The truth is, Mr. Whiskers isn't just a hamster. He's a symbol and a test." As Edward began to explain, Sarah listened with growing astonishment. The story that unfolded was one of love, loss, and a decades-old secret that had shaped the lives of not just the Holloway family, but the entire town of Millbrook. Meanwhile, at the veterinary clinic, James Carter was facing a moral dilemma of his own. Elizabeth's revelation had put him in an impossible position. As a veterinarian, he had a duty to report any suspected animal abuse. But as a friend, he felt compelled to protect Elizabeth. "Lizzie," he said gently, "you know I have to report this, right?" Elizabeth's head snapped up, panic in her eyes. "No, James, please. You don't understand. If this gets out, it'll destroy my family. And the truth about Mr. Whiskers, it's not what everyone thinks." James frowned, puzzled. "What do you mean? What truth?" Elizabeth opened her mouth to respond, but before she could, the clinic door burst open. Charles Holloway stormed in, his face a mask of fury. "There you are," he snarled at Elizabeth. "I've been looking everywhere for you. And the hamster, hand it over, Liz. This ends now." James stepped between them, his voice firm. "Mr. Holloway, I'm going to have to ask you to leave. This is a place of healing, not confrontation." Charles's eyes narrowed dangerously. "Stay out of this, doctor. This is family business." As the tension in the room reached a boiling point, none of them noticed the small figure watching from the doorway, Timothy Holloway, the youngest of Edward's children, his eyes wide with shock and a cell phone clutched tightly in his hand. The secrets of Millbrook were starting to unravel, and soon, nothing would ever be the same again. The tension in the veterinary clinic was palpable as Charles Holloway glared at his sister and the veterinarian. Timothy, still unnoticed in the doorway, pressed record on his phone, his hand shaking slightly. "Charles, please," Elizabeth pleaded, her voice barely above a whisper. "Think about what you're doing. This isn't what Mom would have wanted." At the mention of their mother, Charles's face contorted with a mixture of pain and anger. "Don't you dare bring her into this, Liz. You have no idea what she would have wanted." Dr. Carter, sensing the situation was spiraling out of control, tried to intervene. "Mr. Holloway, I understand you're upset, but threatening your sister and a defenseless animal isn't the answer. Why don't we all take a moment to calm down and—" "Calm down?" Charles laughed bitterly. "You want me to calm down when my entire inheritance is about to go to a rodent? When everything I've worked for my entire life is being torn away because of my father's senility?" Elizabeth's eyes flashed with sudden anger. "Is that all you care about? The money? Have you forgotten everything Dad taught us about compassion? About helping others?" Charles scoffed. "Oh, spare me the sanctimonious lecture, Liz. We both know Dad's teachings were nothing but hypocritical nonsense. He preached about compassion while neglecting his own family. And now this final insult." As the siblings argued, Dr. Carter noticed a small movement from the corner of his eye. He turned to see Timothy standing in the doorway, phone in hand, his young face a mask of shock and confusion. "Tim," James said softly, drawing the attention of Charles and Elizabeth. Charles's eyes widened in surprise, then narrowed dangerously. "Timothy, what are you doing here? Give me that phone. Now." Timothy backed away, shaking his head. "No, Charles. I think it's time we all knew the truth. About everything." Before Charles could react, Timothy turned and ran out of the clinic. Charles made to follow, but Dr. Carter blocked his path. "That's enough," James said firmly. "I don't know what's going on with your family, but I won't allow any more threats or violence in my clinic. Now, I suggest you all leave before I'm forced to call the authorities." Charles glared at the veterinarian for a long moment before turning to Elizabeth. "This isn't over, Liz. Not by a long shot." With that, he stormed out of the clinic. Elizabeth slumped against the examination table, her face in her hands. "Oh, James, what have I done?" Dr. Carter placed a comforting hand on her shoulder. "Lizzie, I think it's time you told me the whole story. What's really going on with your family and this hamster?" Elizabeth looked up, her eyes filled with a mixture of fear and resolve. "You're right, but not here. We need to go to the manor. It's time everyone knew the truth." As they left the clinic, neither noticed the figure watching from across the street, Victoria Holloway, Charles's wife, her face a mask of calculated interest as she pulled out her phone and dialed a number. "Hello? Yes, it's Victoria. You're not going to believe what I just overheard." Meanwhile, at Holloway Manor, Edward had finished telling Sarah Thompson the incredible story behind Mr. Whiskers and his unconventional will. Sarah sat in stunned silence, trying to process everything she'd just heard. "Mr. Holloway, I don't know what to say. This is unbelievable," Edward supplied with a sad smile. "I know, but I assure you, every word is true." Sarah shook her head, still bewildered. "But why now? After all these years, why reveal everything like this?" Edward's eyes clouded with emotion. "Because, my dear, I'm dying. The doctors give me 6 months, a year at most. And before I go, I need to make things right. For Amelia, for the town, and for my children." As if on cue, the study door burst open, and Timothy ran in, out of breath and clutching his phone. "Dad, you won't believe what just happened at the vet's office." Edward and Sarah exchanged a worried glance. "Timothy, calm down," Edward said gently. "What's going on?" But before Timothy could explain, they heard the sound of car doors slamming outside. Edward went to the window and saw Elizabeth and Dr. Carter hurrying up the driveway, followed closely by Charles's sleek sports car. Edward sighed heavily. "It seems the moment of truth has arrived sooner than I expected." He turned to Sarah and Timothy. "I think you both should stay. What happens next will affect the entire town, and you deserve to hear it firsthand." As footsteps echoed in the hallway, Edward steeled himself for the confrontation to come. The time for secrets was over. Now, he could only hope that the truth would be enough to heal the wounds of the past and forge a new future for his family and for Millbrook. The tension in Edward Holloway's study was thick enough to cut with a knife as Charles burst through the door, followed closely by Elizabeth and Dr. Carter. Victoria slipped in moments later, her face a mask of feigned concern. "What is the meaning of this, Father?" Charles demanded, his eyes darting between Edward and the others in the room. "First the will, and now I find out you've been conspiring with Elizabeth behind my back?" Edward remained calm, his voice steady as he addressed his eldest son. "Charles, please, sit down. All of you, it's time we had a family meeting." "Family meeting?" Charles scoffed. "Is that what you call disinheriting your own children in favor of a rodent?" Sarah Thompson, feeling out of place in the family drama, made to leave. "Perhaps I should go." "No," Edward said firmly. "Please stay, Sarah. What I'm about to say concerns the whole town, and as a teacher, you have a right to hear it." As everyone settled into chairs around the study, an uneasy silence fell over the room. Edward took a deep breath, his eyes moving from one face to another before finally resting on the hamster cage on his desk. "I suppose I should start at the beginning," he said softly. "It was 30 years ago when I met a young woman named Amelia." Over the next hour, Edward wove a tale that left his audience spellbound. He spoke of Amelia, a bright-eyed social worker with dreams of changing the world, of their whirlwind romance and secret marriage, of the tragic accident that took her life just weeks before he was to announce their union to the world. "But that's not all," Edward continued, his voice thick with emotion. "Before she died, Amelia told me she was pregnant." A collective gasp filled the room. Charles leaned forward, his face a mixture of shock and disbelief. "What are you saying, Father?" Edward's eyes met Charles's. "I'm saying, my son, that you have a sister who grew up in Millbrook, never knowing her true heritage." Elizabeth's hand flew to her mouth, tears streaming down her face. "Dad, who is she?" Edward turned to Sarah, who sat frozen in her chair, her face pale. "I think you already know, don't you, Sarah?" All eyes in the room turned to the high school teacher, who looked as if she might faint. "Me?" she whispered. "But how?" Edward nodded, a sad smile on his face. "Amelia made me promise to let you have a normal life, away from the pressures of the Holloway name. She wanted you to forge your own path, to make your own choices. So I watched from afar as you grew up, as you became the wonderful woman you are today." The room erupted into chaos. Charles jumped to his feet, his face red with anger. "This is preposterous. You expect us to believe this fairy tale?" Victoria placed a hand on her husband's arm, her eyes calculating. "Charles, darling, perhaps we should hear him out." Timothy, who had been quiet until now, spoke up. "But Dad, what does all this have to do with Mr. Whiskers?" Edward chuckled softly. "Ah yes, Mr. Whiskers. You see, when I rescued him from the pet store last year, something about his eyes reminded me of Amelia. It was then that I realized I couldn't keep the truth hidden any longer. I needed a way to bring everything to light, to test the true character of my children and the town." He looked at each of his children in turn. "The will was a test to see who among you would show the compassion and selflessness that Amelia valued so much, to see who would look beyond their own interests to care for a small, defenseless creature." Elizabeth let out a choked sob. "Oh, Dad, I'm so sorry. I tried to protect Mr. Whiskers, but I was too afraid to stand up to Charles." Charles, his anger deflating, slumped back into his chair. "And I failed the test, didn't I? I was so focused on the money, on my own ambitions, that I lost sight of what really matters." Edward nodded, his eyes filled with a mixture of sadness and hope. "Yes, you did, but it's not too late to make things right. All of you, including you, Sarah." Sarah, who had been silent throughout Edward's revelation, finally found her voice. I don't know what to say. This is all so overwhelming. Edward reached out and took her hand. I know, my dear, and I'm sorry for keeping this from you for so long, but now we have a chance to be a real family. All of us. As the gravity of the situation settled over the room, Dr. Carter cleared his throat. Mr. Holloway, I hate to interrupt, but what about Mr. Whiskers? Is he really going to inherit everything? Edward laughed, the sound breaking the tension in the room. No, James. Mr. Whiskers was just a symbol, a catalyst to bring us all together. The real inheritance, well, that's something we'll need to discuss as a family. A complete family. As Edward looked around at the stunned faces of his children, both old and newly discovered, he felt a weight lift from his shoulders. The truth was out, and though he knew there would be challenges ahead, he also knew that the healing could finally begin. Outside the study window, the sun broke through the clouds, casting a warm glow over Millbrook. In that moment, Edward Holloway knew that his beloved Amelia would be proud. The seeds of compassion and truth she had planted so long ago were finally beginning to bloom. The days following Edward's revelation were a whirlwind of emotion and adjustment for the Holloway family and the town of Millbrook. The news of Sarah Thompson's true identity spread quickly, causing a mixture of shock, disbelief, and eventually, acceptance among the townsfolk. At Mabel's place, the diner buzzed with conversation as people tried to process the incredible turn of events. Well, I'll be, Mabel said, shaking her head as she poured coffee for her regulars. Sarah Thompson, a Holloway, who would have thought? Dr. James Carter, seated at the counter, smiled wryly. It certainly explains a lot. Sarah always did have a way of bringing out the best in her students, just like old Edward with his business partners. As the town gossiped and speculated, the Holloway family was working through their own complex emotions behind the closed doors of the manor. Sarah sat in the study, surrounded by photo albums and old letters, her eyes wide with wonder as she discovered her mother's history. Elizabeth sat beside her, pointing out details in the photographs. Look at Mom's smile here, Elizabeth said softly, her finger tracing the outline of Amelia's face in a faded picture. You have the same smile, you know? Sarah blinked back tears, her voice barely above a whisper. I always wondered where I got it from. My adoptive parents. They were wonderful, but I never quite felt like I belonged. From the doorway, Charles watched the scene unfold, his expression a mixture of regret and uncertainty. Victoria approached him, placing a hand on his arm. Charles, she said quietly, maybe it's time you joined them. He shook his head, his voice rough with emotion. How can I, after everything I've done, everything I said? Victoria squeezed his arm gently. The only way to move forward is to take that first step. Your father gave us all a second chance. Don't waste it. Taking a deep breath, Charles stepped into the room. Sarah and Elizabeth looked up, their conversation halting abruptly. I was hoping we could talk, Charles said, his usual confidence noticeably absent. All of us. As the siblings began the difficult process of reconnecting and rebuilding trust, Edward watched from his favorite armchair. Mr. Whiskers perched contentedly on his lap. Timothy sat at his feet, absently stroking the hamster's soft fur. Dad, Timothy said, looking up at his father. What happens now? With the company, the money, everything? Edward smiled, ruffling his youngest son's hair. Now, my boy, we build something new. Something that honors your mother's memory and brings this family and this town together. Over the next few weeks, the Holloway family worked tirelessly to create a new vision for their future. With Sarah's input as an educator, they established the Amelia Holloway Foundation, dedicated to providing educational opportunities and social services to underprivileged families in Millbrook and beyond. Charles, much to everyone's surprise, threw himself into the foundation's work with unexpected zeal. His business acumen, combined with Elizabeth's compassion and Sarah's understanding of the community's needs, proved to be a powerful combination. As for Mr. Whiskers, he became something of a local celebrity. Edward jokingly appointed him as the foundation's chief inspiration officer, and his image appeared on all the Foundation's literature, a small, furry reminder of the unconditional love and compassion that had brought them all together. 1 year later, the town of Millbrook gathered in the newly renovated town square for the grand opening of the Amelia Holloway Community Center. The modern building stood proudly next to the old town hall, its large windows reflecting the bright autumn sunlight. Edward Holloway, looking frail but happy, sat in a wheelchair at the center of the stage, surrounded by his children. Sarah, Elizabeth, Charles, and Timothy stood united, their faces beaming with pride as they addressed the crowd. "My friends and neighbors," Edward began, his voice wavering slightly with emotion. "A year ago, I made a decision that many of you thought was crazy. I left my entire fortune to a hamster." A ripple of laughter spread through the audience. "But that decision led us here, to this moment, where we can create something truly meaningful for our community." Sarah stepped forward, her hand resting gently on Edward's shoulder. "This center is more than just a building. It's a promise to every child in Millbrook that they will have the opportunity to learn, grow, and reach their full potential, regardless of their circumstances." As Sarah spoke, Dr. James Carter watched from the crowd, a small smile playing on his lips. Beside him, Mabel dabbed at her eyes with a handkerchief. "Who would have thought," she whispered to James, "that a little hamster could change so much?" James chuckled softly. "Sometimes, Mabel, the smallest things can have the biggest impact." On stage, Charles took the microphone, his face solemn. "I stand before you today not just as a Holloway, but as a changed man. This past year has taught me the true value of family, community, and compassion. I hope that through this foundation, we can all learn to be a little kinder, a little more understanding, and a lot more connected." As the ribbon-cutting ceremony concluded and the townspeople filed into the new community center, Edward found himself alone for a moment, gazing out at the town he'd called home for so long. He felt a presence beside him and looked up to see Margaret, his faithful housekeeper, smiling down at him. "She would be proud, you know," Margaret said softly, nodding towards the portrait of Amelia that hung in the center's lobby. "Both of you." Edward reached out and took Margaret's hand, his eyes misting over. "Thank you, old friend, for everything." Inside the center, Timothy led a group of excited children to a special enclosure near the main hall. Inside, Mr. Whiskers scampered happily in a large, custom-built habitat, complete with tunnels, wheels, and plenty of treats. "And this," Timothy announced proudly, "is our Chief Inspiration Officer, Mr. Whiskers. He's here to remind us all that sometimes the most important things in life are the little things we do for each other." As the day wound down and the last of the visitors left the center, the Holloway family gathered once more in Edward's study at the manor. Sarah raised a glass, her eyes shining with emotion. "To family," she said, looking around at the faces of her newfound siblings and father. "And to new beginnings." "To Amelia," Edward added softly, his gaze resting on his late wife's portrait above the fireplace. "May her spirit of kindness and compassion live on through all of us." As they clinked their glasses together, Mr. Whiskers let out a contented squeak from his cage on Edward's desk. The small sound brought smiles to everyone's faces, a reminder of the unlikely catalyst that had brought them all together. Outside, the sun set over Millbrook, casting a warm glow over the town. In homes and businesses across the community, people settled in for the evening, their hearts a little fuller and their spirits a little lighter. The tale of the millionaire, the hamster, and the long-lost daughter had become part of the town's lore. A story of love, redemption, and the enduring power of compassion. And in the quiet of the study, as his family laughed and shared stories around him, Edward Holloway knew that he had finally fulfilled his promise to Amelia. He had created a legacy of love and kindness that would endure long after he was gone, all thanks to a tiny hamster named Mr. Whiskers. Thank you for listening until the end. Share your opinion about the story in the comments and let us know which character you liked the most. If this story touched you and you want to hear more, click on the next story appearing on your screen. Leave a like and subscribe to our channel so we can build a great community of people who share emotional stories together. Until the next story.